So what are the tools of organizing today, and who and what are the front lines? Our guest for this segment is a man who knows his way around a courtroom and Capitol Hill. It's Faiz Shakir. He's the National Political Director for the ACLU. Welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.
Great. So let's start with the basics. What is the ACLU and what exactly do you do?
Well, the ACLU is the foremost leader in defending civil rights and civil liberties of all people in America. We've been fighting in the courtroom for well over 95, 96 years, fighting for the rights of marriage equality, racial justice, voting rights, reproductive health and freedom. So many issues under the sun. And now, of course, under our current president, it feels like one of the most trying and taxing times for our institution, in which every issue that we work on is under assault.
You had said to me before that the ACLU is a nonpartisan organization. What exactly does that mean, since it sounds like it has a very liberal bent?
That's right. So we've been a nonpartisan institution, meaning that we do not endorse or oppose candidates for office of either party. We don't take a stance in elections in that manner. And when we do so, when we get engaged on the political advocacy side and when we get engaged in court proceedings, we do so on the basis of principles and issues that we care deeply about. And oftentimes those issues will side with one particular ideology or a group of folks. We tend to often have progressive leanings on a variety of issues on LGBT equality, reproductive freedom. However, there's a number of issues that we work on that have broad appeal across the board and, in fact, defend the rights of conservatives to speak in venues, sometimes at our own peril because they're unpopular stances that we take, but we take them out of principle. We defend people against warrantless surveillance, an issue that cuts across a lot of ideologies, and a lot of libertarians tend to side with us on those matters. And there's a whole variety of areas around data privacy these days, and your rights to assembly, your rights to speak, that affect all people.
Yeah, I think when we spoke before, you were saying that the ACLU was involved with the Charlottesville rallies.
That's right. That's right. And in that case, you defend the rights of white supremacists to speak, not to say that you agree with them, just simply that they have the same right, they should be afforded the same right and ability to speak as any other group, any other politically motivated group that you might agree with or disagree with. I think from our perspective and the experience that we encountered through Charlottesville, we became a little more concerned about groups that might be carrying firearms to a protest. And we have taken the posture that if you are going to be a group that utilizes carrying firearms, that might not be the kind of protest activity that we would be in support of. So that was certainly one area in which, coming out of Charlottesville, we kind of took a look at our own posture, and we're continuing to do that to make sure that while we defend the rights of all, we do so in a way that people find to be reasonable and consistent.
So you've talked about civil liberties. What exactly are they, and which are the focus of the ACLU?
There's so many issues in this day and age that we find ourselves fighting over, but there's 6 major ones. Immigration rights, huge one at this point in time.
Yeah.
Criminal justice reform, particularly reducing mass incarceration across the United States. Voting rights, marriage equality, LGBTQ issues, particularly trans rights, reproductive freedom, and privacy and surveillance issues. So those are the 6 major ones. I would say that what the current president has done is compelled us to make sure that we're fighting over other areas that we thought we had won, areas that we thought we had made a lot of progress on. So even basic things like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, separation of church and state, Those kinds of issues have become even more prominent under this administration, and we find ourselves engaged in much more often on a daily basis. Freedom of the media, I should say, too, by the way.
Yes. So it reinforces the fact that our Bill of Rights and Constitution is a living, breathing document that must be looked at in every generation and through different political periods of time to make sure that it is currently and fresh, used in a fresh way for everyone.
And I would say that in this particular moment, that it's a refounding. I feel like it's a refounding moment. That means that we're constantly finding that we have to re-educate everybody about why do we have freedom of speech? Why do we have freedom of assembly? Why do we care about basic rights of the press? Why do we want marriage equality? Why do we want non-discrimination in our police forces and those kinds of matters? It feels like this particular moment is one that we constantly have to be vigorously fighting over civil rights and civil liberties, but explaining the undergirding principles because they, quite frankly, are being challenged in a way very explicitly on a daily basis at the highest levels of our government.
So you've just caused me to think of one other question we did not discuss before, but I wanted to ask you, as you travel around the country and as you do your work with the ACLU, what are some of these basic rights that you find people either don't know or understand or misinterpret? Because I think there's a whole lot about what it means to be a citizen in this country that many of us just don't know.
Yeah, and I think like part of it is speech. I think one of the areas that is hardest in this day and age is that, people want to be out there and aggressive and doing wonderful protest activities, raising their voices. And of course, we at the ACLU encourage it.
Yes.
And we try to really help explain what your rights are as you go about protesting. But there's also a healthy amount of that protest activity that is purely civil disobedience, right? That is breaking the rules to change the rules.
Yeah.
And that is totally, one's prerogative. It may not be necessarily within the confines of the rule of law, which is part of our job to help explain that, hey, if you want to undertake certain activities, the law may not be your protection here, but you just have to know that and understand that you're engaging in certain activities because you're trying to raise the awareness of the general public and you're trying to break the laws to change the laws. And so for a lot of our friends who are fighting over police misconduct or fighting over gun safety or a variety of issues, women's freedom, they're out in the streets, they're fighting, and we're trying to make sure that they know their rights, what you can do, what you can't do, and that around the things that you can't do, you just have to make a decision about what you deem to be best for your movement.
And whether or not you're willing to handle the repressions.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's right. You own the repercussions. And I say related to that, in this realm of kind of educating people about their rights, related to that is this issue of knowing your rights when the FBI comes knocking on your door or ICE comes knocking on your bus, your Greyhound bus, right. Or when the police come chasing you around the corner, you should just know what your rights are. We find ourselves far more engaged in this effort to kind of explain what your rights are in various different circumstances.
I think that's important too, because as many people are discussing, we don't learn this in school anymore.
No.
It's vital.
And it's so important to trying to educate people around how to make the positive change that we want to see happen. So like if in many cases, police are abusing their authority. They don't even know what the rights are. So the more informed we are about our rights, the more we can actually be the agents of change and compelling progress that we want to see happen.
You're saying this and it's causing, I'm getting a little off topic from what we had discussed, but you're saying that about how sometimes police don't really know the rights. However, many of us run into the problem of if we do, then it sounds like we're correcting the police or being insubordinate, which seems to ratchet up the resistance and the response.
And there's two sides of this coin in every encounter. There's the rights, right? What is established by statute, law, but then there's the style, right? And so many of the times you're winning over a particular situation by the manner and temperament that you conduct yourself with. So I talk about this all the time in the context of our volunteers who are doing advocacy all around the country with state legislators, with their sheriffs, with their district attorneys. They're going in and meeting with them. And I try to explain, though, while we're advocates for particular policy change, and we want to be fierce advocates, we want to be knowledgeable advocates, we want to be pushy, right? We're agitators.
Yes.
However, be mindful that you're lobbying, right? You're lobbying, and that the successful lobbying is that you appreciate and understand and put yourself in the shoes of the other. And try to reflect and emote in a way that they appreciate who you are and you appreciate who they are. Because so much of these determinations about whether we succeed or not is simply building a movement of allies. And even if people aren't currently in your camp, our goal is to recruit them into it, right? Our movement cannot succeed if it remains constrained. And the job of a movement is to grow and attract more people in. So you have to, by definition, be involving those who aren't necessarily aligned with you at the outset, and you'll be thinking about all the ways that you bring them in.
So the word I like to use is enrolling, as opposed to convincing someone or bullying them into it. We're really trying to meet people where they are, and may the power of our ideas and our facts win over as well.
That's right. And you as a person, you have a story, you have a history, you have things that you want to share, and you want them to just see the world through your lens, and you want to be able to convey that in as empathetic a manner as possible.
So let's talk about the program you launched last October, Let People Vote. Talk about what Let People Vote is.
Yeah, so we've been facing this challenge on voting rights for the past decade, ever since President Obama was elected, quite frankly, where shortly thereafter, right, in 2008, he was elected. In 2010, what did we see all across the country? Voting restrictions come into play. And from 2010, 2012, 2014, 2016, the numbers of restrictions continued to grow. Voter ID, right, imposed all across the country, various forms of photo identification. The ability for students to register became a lot harder. Polling hours being cut, polling locations being cut, longer lines. These kinds of things were not an accident. They were done in a manner to depress the vote. In many places where incumbents felt like they were trying to stomp out the vote so that they could preserve and maintain office. And so what we've been trying to do is say, okay, we've been playing on defense for a very long time on voting rights. Let's play on offense. Let's play on offense. That's the Let People Vote campaign. What are things that we can do? What are policy changes that we can make right now that would expand voting access and participation in our democracy? And we came up with three major ones. One is re-enfranchising formerly incarcerated individuals. That's a big one. There are about almost 6 million people across the United States who are formerly incarcerated who are not allowed to vote. We're fighting to change the law so that they can. Number two is end this partisan gerrymandering problem, right? Because of the way these districts are cut, your vote is diluted. And it doesn't count as much as others. And
I got to stop you there, because you have to talk about what does that mean? What does gerrymandering mean? And how could the vote be diluted if it's one person, one vote?
Right. So the gerrymander is the ability of politicians to carve various districts of voting representation. So the way that the 435 members of the the U.S. House of Representatives are divided is that each state legislature gets to decide where the boundaries are. Right. We generally have a few 100,000 people in every district, but the state legislatures get to decide where the boundary lines are. And oftentimes, when they determine the boundary lines, they do so in a way that preserves incumbency. They want to make sure that the people who are in office get to maintain office. And so therefore, they make it harder for people to challenge them, for challengers to challenge them and win. And by doing so, they comprise these districts in such a way that they are not easily flippable, right? They aren't easy to change over from one cycle to the next. And therefore, your democratic vote in a situation where you want to try to change, it gets harder and harder to do so because you're locked into a particular geographic area where your vote just won't matter as much as other places. And we saw this in Wisconsin, for instance. In Wisconsin, you had a state assembly and that was 60% Republican, right? Well, but only less than 50% of the people who had voted for Republicans, and yet the state assembly was 60% Republican. How did that happen, right? It's because of the way the districts are cut.
Yeah.
And so then just a few years later, the numbers of votes for Republicans went up dramatically. I want to say another 10%, like over 50, closer to 60%. Guess what happened to state legislature? It remained at 60%. It didn't matter like what the numbers of votes were coming in. The results were locked in. They were predetermined, and that's not a representative democracy when we already know what the outcomes are going to be before people vote.
So could you just go back 1 second and talk again about why this redistricting or changing the borders happens? I would think that once it's set, it should stay that way. So how does that happen again?
Yeah, so right now there's so much discretionary authority that state legislators have to create the districts at will. And they do it so with bias, right? In a lot of cases with people of color, they throw them all in one geographic area and say, okay, you get your one person. And instead of giving them the opportunity to influence and persuade 3 or 4 different districts, you just lock them into one. And many of you seen these maps, they kind of end up looking like these weird geometric shapes that make no sense to anybody. Yeah. What we're trying to push for is that there should be independent commissions based off of simple technology and math that apportions people in a way that allows these districts to be even, right? So that the representatives that we elect are more responsive to the broad swath of Americans rather than feeling like they have to constantly represent a wing of this, right? Because if you have too much of a concentration of one particular ideology in an area, then the representatives are only representing an ideology, not all of us. So that's a real challenge, and I think an independent commission is the best way to go about it. We're fighting for that in red states and blue states right now. We have volunteers working in the state of Utah with a Better Boundaries Coalition to create an independent commission that will go on to the ballot in November of 2018. And this just underscores that we want to be for the principle of nonpartisan redistricting commissions, regardless of what color that state might be.
So you talked about gerrymandering and voting, and I think the third category is felon re-enfranchisement. Is that right?
Right. So I was talking about felon. That was the first one I mentioned, was felon re-enfranchisement. We're fighting for it in the state of Florida right now, where 1.5 million formerly incarcerated individuals are barred from voting. It's ridiculous, and it's been on the books since 1868, after the enactment of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution, which purportedly granted emancipation. So we had a lot of southern states react to emancipation by saying, you know what, maybe we'll just create new felonies, and we'll try to felonize people of color. And what ended up happening is, of course, over time, a lot of people of color got wrapped up in this and then lost their right to vote. Now it's been on the books for so long that you have 70% of the people in the state of Florida are not people of color who are being denied their right to vote. It affects everybody. And 1.5 million people. It's ridiculous. And so we're going to try to change their state constitution to restore the rights of formerly incarcerated individuals to vote. And we have gathered over 1 million signatures to place it on the ballot with the help of a grassroots coalition led by Desmond Meade in Florida called the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. And we in November of 2018, we need 60% of the vote in Florida to succeed. So we're really hopeful about that. And the third category is voter modernization. And when I say voter modernization, I mean automatic voter registration. Same-day voter registration, those kinds of simple reforms. Quite frankly, they're very simple, right? But they could increase voting participation a ton because, let's be real, a lot of people don't think in advance to register, right? On election day rolls around and they're like, oh, you know what? I didn't register.
I forgot. Yes, exactly.
It's too late. In many states, you are not allowed to vote. It's too late. And what we'd like to do is be able to, institute reforms at the state level that allow you to do election day registration. Show up on the at the polling booth on election day, register and vote, and get
So
counted.
that would mean then that these ID rules need to be more commensurate as well. So that if we can do this, register that day, then also a driver's license will work, or one of these city or state issued ID cards, as opposed to what's happening now in many places where people are ratcheting up the numbers of pieces of identification needed to vote.
Yeah, so that is an area that we have been fighting in the court of law for a long time. In fact, we're in Kansas right now fighting with their Secretary of State, a guy named Chris Kobach, who has been kind of the architect of so many of these photo ID laws. And their argument, the Kobach argument, is that, well, our elections are not secure, and that there's so many undocumented people. People who shouldn't be allowed to vote who are voting. And our lawyers have been making the argument in court and challenging them to produce evidence that that is true, and they haven't been able to produce any evidence. And in fact, there's literally, you could count on one hand the number of people who voted quote unquote illegally in Kansas. And I think in many of those cases, it's an accident. It's purely an individual who did not fully understand that, I was moving from the state of Arkansas to the state of Kansas, and I didn't register in time. I thought I was going to be allowed to vote here, but, I just didn't register in time. Or I'm a formerly incarcerated individual. I didn't realize that I'm not allowed to vote. I thought I was allowed to, I'm a naturalized citizen. I thought I was allowed to vote. These are very, very small numbers of instances, and they take these instances of innocence, in which somebody just didn't intentionally try to deceive or defraud an election, and they blow it up and they do so in a way to try to disenfranchise so many others and make the ability for people to vote that much harder to accomplish.
So let's get back to talking about organizing, because that's what this telesummit is all about: how to organize and how to create strategies around activism. Mm-hmm. So how did you go about getting people involved in the Let People Vote campaign?
So the first step that we took in the Let People Vote campaign is we had these three major buckets of areas that we want to play an offense on in policy change. They were ex-felon reenfranchisement. It was voting modernization, automatic voter registration and same-day voter registration, and it was partisan gerrymandering. We went to each of our affiliates at the ACLU. We're fortunate to have an affiliate in every state in the United States. We go to them and say, in your state, what is the one call to action? What's the one policy change that we could do to expand voting participation in your state? And that's important because in the United States, we have a very fragmented system of voting. Each state governs its own voting laws. Right now, we don't have a federal government who is being very responsive to voting rights issues, and so there's nothing passing out of Congress to address voting concerns. The Voting Rights Act is kind of suffering as a result, so we have to go state by state by state by state. So we reached out to every state to get one particular call to action. Then we reached out to all of our volunteers and said, here's the ask, and we want to get you enlisted in this effort, and we're asking for your participation to call your state representatives, to write letters to the editor, to do some phone banking, to do some door-to-door canvassing, to try to get these measures passed. And fortunately, we're seeing some really good successes as a result of that.
So what has been the response around
Yes. So we've had a number of successes on the on Let People Vote campaign. In Washington State, we just passed a Washington Voting Rights Act, which we're really excited about, which puts in place a lot of the original principles of the Voting Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act, that have been diluted by either national court rulings or by Congress, right, the federal. But the state of Washington has now raised the bar for the state of Washington to allow for stronger voting rights laws in place, and to ensure that people of color particularly are not being diluted or discriminated against. So we're excited about that. We just passed it with the help of so many volunteers, and the governor just signed it. And also allows for pre-registration of 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds. It's a wonderful piece of
great. So in terms of the campaign on a national level and grassroots, how many people are participating now?
Well over 200,000 people are participating across the country. So we're really excited about that. And I should keep going with some of the successes in Florida. As I said, to get this reenfranchisement of formerly incarcerated individuals, the initiative onto the ballot, we needed 766,000 verified signatures. We got 1.1 million.
Wow, great.
Volunteers. It was great. And in Michigan, we're now doing a ballot initiative to implement same-day voter registration there. We're out there collecting signatures. All our volunteers are hustling on the ground, and I think we're going to get it done. Hopefully, we need 315,000 signatures, verified signatures, by the end of June, and we're working hard on getting that right now. In the state of Maryland, we just succeeded in getting an initiative placed onto the ballot that would implement election day registration. And that was by the work of our volunteers in the state legislature who responded to the calls to action and have placed this on the ballot. So now we got to win. And I was mentioning in Utah, where we're working on a nonpartisan redistricting commission with a coalition of folks out there. We're going to be successful in getting that onto the ballot in November of 2018. So the short story is, I think in November, when you go to the voting booths, there's going to be a lot of opportunities to expand voting rights in this country because of the work that so many volunteers have put into these campaigns.
And what you're highlighting here is also in each state, the people on the campaign pick the aspect of this that they feel is most viable where they are or most critical where they are. So as the person overviewing all of this, the ACLU and you really have to have a long view in mind and be sensitive to how it could vary in different parts of the country.
For sure. I'll give you one example. In Nebraska, for instance, we have a very conservative governor, very hard to get things passed there. But we have a particular call to action, which is to waive a 2-year waiting period for formerly incarcerated individuals to get their voting rights back. By some silly rule of the legislature, if you're a formerly incarcerated individual and you serve your time, you have to wait additional
2 years.
2 years. No reason for it, but they want to make you wait for 2 years. And we are trying to waive that. We've gotten it passed through the legislature once before and the governor vetoed it. This time around, we're going to increase the pressure, increase the volume, the decibel level on this and try to put some pressure on the governor to try to act. So that, there's an example where it's a long game, as you mentioned, that you got to keep going out.
So is there a difference in your mind in the emphasis from gearing up towards a presidential election or versus gearing up to like the election coming up in the fall?
I think it's, we have an unprecedented assault on civil rights and civil liberties as a result of this president, and it's in mobilizing a lot of people to go out and get engaged and get involved. In my view, the right way to channel that energy and enthusiasm is to seek the change that you really want at the state level, right? Like if we can be the embodiments of the values that we care so deeply about, the things that we're so upset about at the federal level that are coming from the president and his allies, the way to react to that is to do an equal and opposite reaction at the local level. And say, here, if he's beating up on immigrants, then we're going to pass ordinances at the city and state level to protect our immigrant friends. If he's going to beat up on Muslims, then we're going to undertake actions to defend Muslims at our local level. If he's going to make voting that much harder at the federal level, we're going to fight to change laws in our cities and towns and state to make voting easier. And so I hope that everyone is thinking that for every action that you hate, you're thinking about an equal and opposite reaction, closest to home.
Well, that works in science and it works in this too, huh?
But unlike a Newtonian, right? So the Newtonian laws of physics are that an equal and opposite reaction naturally occurs. In this case, it is not naturally occurring. You got to fight for it. You got to be the equal and opposite reaction.
Well, I have to admit, talking with you and with the people that I've been working with in this summit has let me see how much work is involved in being just a knowledgeable, aware citizen, how much I've taken for granted, how much I don't know, and how much I'm grateful to the people like you who are in the trenches doing this kind of work. So for others who are like me, hearing all of this and looking around and saying, what can I do in my community? How can we get in touch with the Let People Vote campaign?
Sure. Well, the first step you can do is to go to peoplepower.org, www.peoplepower.org, sign up, and we're going to get you information immediately about what particular actions in your state you could undertake with us. In some cases, it will definitely be the Let People Vote campaign. We'll let you know what that campaign is. And then there might be a criminal justice issue, or there might be some kind of reproductive health fight. These are intersectional moments. Issues that affect so many marginalized and vulnerable communities across the country are impacted. We've got to step up for them, because ultimately, at any point in time, we could be on the receiving end.
Yes.
So I think that it's really important that we think about this time and era intersectionally and stand up for vulnerable and marginalized communities, because we could find ourselves there very easily. And as you were talking, I was reflecting on a conversation I had with one of our volunteers, and he was out in Austin, Texas, and he's gotten engaged for the first time, and he's really leading a wonderful group down there. And he said, yeah, I hadn't really voted before. And what I'm realizing now is that sorry, one second. Okay. So he says, yeah, I haven't voted before, but what I realize now is that having not voted was a luxury. Having not been interested in politics was a luxury, because, quite frankly, there weren't issues that were impacting his life. He's sitting around saying, my life is fine. And now he's realizing that you have to speak out. You have to get involved. You have to get engaged. And if you don't, you're just allowing other people to dictate the kinds of policies, the way this country is going to operate. And I think this is a moment, it's a call to arms for everybody, that if you've been sitting on your hands, now's the time. No judgments, right? No judgments about what you've done in the past. Yes. Now's the time to fix it and to get engaged. Find any way to get engaged. If you're involved with People Power, wonderful, thank you, welcome you aboard. But find any avenue, any outlet. There's so many groups who are doing wonderful work around the country. Find your calling, get involved.
I think this young man was giving a perfect example of, as you said, a luxury, and folks exercising their privilege. Yes. They don't have to worry. There's no real repercussions that they can see about not participating. Yes. But you said something that I think was a title of Angela Davis's book, If They Come For Me at Night, They'll Be Coming For You in the Morning. Thank you so much for the hard work you do, for the strategy you put in place, and for your dedication. So that again is peoplepower.org, right?
Yes, that's right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Take good care.